Hello, my name is Dr. Stephen Moore, and I am a 20th century conflict historian specialising in air power. The introduction of military technology involves the integration of equipment and personnel alongside developing tactical doctrine to produce a working weapons system before operations begin. This paper will show how Fighter Command were not granted the luxury of time to perfect the night air defence of the United Kingdom, and the extended development of AI radar and later introduction of the Beaufighter meant the Luftwaffe were practically unopposed during the winter of 1940. Although the GCI AI Beaufighter weapons system was proven by the end of the Blitz, political pressure meant that a lot of time, effort and money was wasted on schemes that failed to achieve comparable results, which continued until 1943. Only Britain entered the war with an aerial command and control system integrated into a nationwide radar network. The characteristics of British chain home radar stations made them unsuitable for direct control of interception, requiring separate readings of range, bearing and height to be calculated in order to visualize a formation, limiting the precision. As the radar stations faced seawards, detection ceased as soon as the raiders crossed the coast, which made the network unsuitable for night defence. At the time the Blitz started, night defence rested on 6 squadrons of underpowered Blenheims equipped with experimental and unreliable radar, as shown in the table. The prototype Blenheim in 1935 had been 40 miles per hour faster than contemporary fighters, but was obsolescent and barely faster than the enemy bombers it was attempting to intercept by 1940. The addition of the radar gear, together with 4 Browning machine guns and ammunition, did nothing to improve the performance margin over potential targets. In addition, 2 squadrons of Defiant turret fighters were also available, relegated from the daylight battle due to their vulnerability, but of limited use as they lacked radar and the crews had uneven night flying experience. The technical complexities of night air defence greatly exceeded those of daylight operations, with 3 additional components being required. A night fighter with a 2-man crew and heavy armament for momentary nocturnal interceptions was essential. To guide the fighter to within detection range, it became clear that a completely new type of ground-based radar would be required. It was also imperative that the fighter was equipped with aircraft interception radar to enable it to close from 20,000 feet to within 500 feet from the target, where the pilot could make visual contact and move into a firing position. As the deficiencies of the daylight radar network were only rectified in the spring of 1940, shortly before the Battle of Britain began, it is hardly surprising that the prototype AI radar only flew for the first time in a Fairey Battle testbed in the summer of 1939. This crude prototype was limited in both minimum and maximum range, and the initial deployment of AI Mark I was a disaster, with several major design faults, including an inability to determine the exact direction of the signal from a target. Despite this, the radar was ordered into production as AI Mark II, but by December 1939, the first 2 marks had been declared operationally useless. Experiments using gun-laying radar to direct a night fighter into visual range overland were carried out from the Kenley sector at the beginning of the Blitz, and a prototype ground control interception radar began testing in October 1940, with a range of 45 miles to guide fighters to their targets. The creation of the Night Interception Committee in early 1940 resulted in the formation of the Fighter Interception Unit to test all new night fighting equipment. The more powerful AI Mark III still suffered from an unsatisfactory minimum range of 1,000 feet, which was unsuitable for visual contact. Frequent failure of AI equipment meant that many contacts were lost or rare interceptions made utilising searchlights without the use of radar. The prototype of the first really effective AI sight, the Mark IV, only began testing in July. This coincided with the availability of the first Bristol Beaufighters, and fighter interception unit trials demonstrated the tracking of targets from 19,000 down to 400 feet. Basing this unit in the Middle of 11 group led to all of its aircraft either being destroyed or damaged due to enemy action during the Battle of Britain. The replacement of this equipment meant that the Beaufighter only began to enter service in October 1940. When German night operations increased as the Blitz began, the lack of a suitable radar network for night interception and the slow introduction of AI Mark IV equipped Beaufighters meant that the Luftwaffe was practically unopposed during operations up to early 1941. During the 17th of October meeting that led to his sacking, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding resisted the suggestions to use visually intercepting, so-called cat's eye fighters at night because they would be useless. His dissension on this issue, "I am carrying out orders which I believe to be dangerous and unsound," probably prompted his dismissal as much as the Big Wing controversy. Air Marshal Sholto Douglas, who succeeded Dowding at Fighter Command, had urged the use of Defiance and Hurricanes at night during August 1940 when he was Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, and immediately assigned Hurricanes permanently to the night fighter role. The desperation of Fighter Command to achieve something can be demonstrated by the use of Hamden bomber aircraft as improvised night fighters at the end of 1940. Douglas issued the order for such patrols to be initiated within 24 hours of assuming command of the fighter defences on the 26th of November. As the Hamdens were too slow to catch German bombers, this tactic was abandoned on the 14th of December, in favour of increased use of single-engine fighters at night. The optimization of the Beaufighter, aircraft interception and ground control interception into an integrated weapons system was not possible before active service, but was performed during operations against night bomber raids over the UK during the winter of 1940-41. Lack of experience in using AI inevitably limited interceptions, but serious faults with the equipment itself did not help. The optimization of the Beaufighter, aircraft interception and ground control interception into an integrated weapons system was not possible before active service, but was performed during operations against night bomber raids over the UK during the winter of 1940-41. Lack of experience in using AI inevitably limited interceptions, but serious faults with the equipment itself did not help. The initial slow supply of aircraft meant that daylight training was not possible, but by November at least one squadron had sufficient to do so. This highlighted that the position of the target aircraft did not correlate with that on the equipment screens, a fault traced as dry soldered and other poor connections in the AI equipment, with all squadrons being alerted to the problem. Measures were also taken to improve the chances of AI fighters achieving success, with an order being issued to close to within 100 yards before opening fire from underneath the target. On the same day, a review of tests for night fighter squadrons was published, showing that of 169 pilots, there were 19 with below average night vision, meaning that 11% of personnel were not capable of fighting at night. The disappointing initial performance of AI prompted Fighter Command to consider less conventional means of air defence. The long approach by the night fighter after AI acquisition into firing position was considered as slow and inefficient when compared to day fighter tactics by air officers who had last seen combat in open cockpit biplanes. The long aerial mine, codenamed Mutton, consisted of 2,000 feet of piano wire with a small bomb at the top and a parachute at the bottom end. This waste of time and resources has been charitably described as clutching at any straw. The use of the Mutton codename is anecdotally rumoured, sadly unsubstantiated, to have been chosen because it could not be dressed as lamb. The theory was that these would be dropped from patrolling aircraft in front of the attacking bombers, where the wire would strike a wing and pull the bomb up to explode on the aircraft. Trials using obsolete Harrow transport aircraft were discouraging and occasionally inflammable, but instead of abandoning the experiment at this stage, the squadron was re-equipped with much faster Havocs, not only continuing to dilute the effectiveness of GCI stations, but also diverting aircraft and crews trained for night interception away from such roles. The Havoc had been identified as being suitable for many different roles, and this multiplicity delayed operational implementation. Another squadron was also using the aircraft in the intruder role over enemy airfields, but while the intruder squadron was successful in disrupting Luftwaffe activity, Mutton achieved nothing except the waste of AI-trained Havoc crews and GCI resources. This method of defence was intended to take advantage of concentrated streams of enemy bombers, and crucially was supported by Professor Frederick Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, who was Churchill's scientific advisor. In 1915 he developed a mathematical theory for aircraft spin recovery, and then learned to fly so he could perform the practical testing of his work, but he subsequently had a difficult relationship with technology. Lindemann's influence with Churchill ensured that trials with long aerial mines continued long after their ineffectiveness was evident. The results of night fighter defence up to the end of the Blitz in July 1941 illustrate that meaningful results were only possible after teething troubles of GCI and the Beaufighter AI Mark IV combination were overcome. The first GCI station became operational on the 1st of January 1941, and a total of 8 were available by May, having been responsible for the destruction of 61 enemy aircraft in that period. The factor limiting the interception of enemy aircraft was the number of fighters that could be controlled. As the original mobile GCI installations were only able to control one fighter at a time, the capability of the stations operating in the event of heavy attacks was limited. Although quantitatively the number of AI-equipped squadrons just started to increase in May 1941, this conceals a qualitative improvement of the defences. While only one extra squadron had been added to the order of battle compared to September 1940, all bar one, which was in the process of replacing its Blenheims, were operating Beaufighters or Havocs equipped with AI Mark IV. Although the optimization of fighters, ground and aerial radar had been achieved by May 1941, further progress was slower than expected. Although single-engine Cat's Eye fighters achieved the most combat and destroyed more aircraft in May than in any other month of 1941, these results did not reflect the effectiveness of this tactic. During highly concentrated raids with good visibility, Cat's Eye fighters were operating under the most favourable conditions. Compared to AI fighters, Cat's Eye aircraft were unable to operate if the moon was below the horizon. An air historical branch analysis calculated that AI fighters were 7 times more likely to shoot down an enemy bomber compared to the Cat's Eye alternative. Despite the enthusiasm of the AOC for the use of single-engine visually intercepting fighters in the night battle, the results were probably not worth the effort expended. On the 12th of May 1941, Douglas was quoted as saying, "AI with GCI was the most profitable means of night interception," which was a similar statement to that which had cost Dowding his job 6 months earlier. The Beaufighter prototype had only flown for the first time in July 1939, and when operations during the first half of 1940 highlighted the limitations of the AI Blenheims, it was clear a better aircraft was required. The Beaufighter was equipped with sleeve valve engines, which had been perfected just before the war, and time was required before engine reliability was satisfactory, with an internal heating system urgently required to protect electrical equipment from damp. Compared to other first-generation monoplane fighters, the Beaufighter entered service much earlier and rapidly became effective in the RAF. Despite flying for the first time 10 months after the Whirlwind, the Beaufighter entered service in the same month. By the time the Beaufighter was in extended service, 22 months after first flying, none of the previous fighters had begun operating with the RAF, so it would have been unrealistic to expect the aircraft to become established more quickly. The RAF was clearly desperate to obtain as many Beaufighters as possible for the night battle. One report complained that on the 1st of November 1940 there were 24 Beaufighters at maintenance units, many already fitted with AI and other equipment and air tested, some of which had been there since the 25th of October. This period of less than a week does not appear excessive, and records show the majority of aircraft were assigned to squadrons within 30 days. The dangers of night flying meant the accidents were commonplace, and during the winter of 1940-41 there was no flying control, airfield lighting was mediocre, and radios were poor. At that stage of the war, the chief task confronting anybody who took off at night was to try and get himself and his aircraft back safely on the ground. The accident rate was extremely high. Ministry of Aircraft Production statistics show that 111 Beaufighters had been delivered to the RAF by the end of 1940. 47 Beaufighters had been fitted with AI by November 1940. On the 14th of December 1940, 85 Blenheims and 57 Beaufighters fitted with AI were with squadrons, implying that nearly half the aircraft delivered in 1940 had been destroyed or seriously damaged. This trend continued as 36 Beaufighters were destroyed or badly damaged in accidents during the first 3 months of 1941, almost half of the 77 in squadron service. This is an aircraft record card, which documents the movement between units and exists for every RAF aircraft. Because I went through 500 of these, I was able to track the expansion of the night fighter force from the delivery of aircraft to and total strength of squadrons up to the end of the Blitz. This table demonstrates that Bow fighter absolute numbers increased very slowly during 1940 and early in 1941 due to high losses from accidents over the winter months, and it took until June 1941 before the numbers of Bow fighters in Fighter Command exceeded 100. A network of suitably equipped airfields for night defence was established across the UK during 1941 with adequate control apparatus. The equipping of bases with blind landing facilities continued throughout 1941, but the system was still incomplete in July. Fighter Command were pioneers in operational research, and by May 1941 the Bow fighter had been in service long enough for Sir Henry Tizard to arrange a meeting between the Ministry of Aircraft Production, Air Ministry, and Fighter Command, including operational aircrew, to discuss progress and agree improvements for the aircraft and radar system. The gun sight was too bright on dark nights, and there had been failures of cannon ammunition when the casing collapsed. Although AI was now routinely checked before operational use, the suspension of the set against the shock of rough landings was unsatisfactory. Dampness was still causing problems, large number of equipment valves were unsatisfactory and had to be rejected, and pilots stressed the need for careful selection and training of AI operators. 16 Bow fighter squadrons were planned by the end of 1941 to expand the night fighter force, but by July only 11 had formed in Fighter Command, not all fully equipped, so that the expansion of the AI squadrons appears unnecessarily slow, with the number of operational aircraft limited by shortages of fully trained aircrew. These numbers were inadequate and were supplanted by bomber pilots trained to fly at night and gunners converted into AI operators after a short course until the establishment of the first night fighter OTU in December 1940, which was the earliest opportunity to resume night training. Ever since night fighter OTUs were established, the standard of training of radar operators had been criticised. By this stage, the AI operators were undergoing a shortened Air Observer School course before the 5-week AI Operation course. Air Marshal Douglas went so far to comment to the Night Air Defence Committee, "Recent results prove that too low a standard of AI operator was accepted in the past. The task demands a higher standard of intelligence. Drastic weeding out of unsuitable operators has already been necessary, but limited intake has prevented this from being carried far enough. A higher standard of man is now coming in for initial training, but the training capacity is, I fear, likely to be inadequate for future needs." With the Luftwaffe concentrating on mine-laying and anti-shipping operations to conserve aircraft during the winter of 1941-42, only 8 aircraft were destroyed by RAF fighters in the first quarter of 1942. It took until the night of the 23rd-24th of April before attacks escalated and the first raid of the Baedeker campaign was attempted. At the start of these attacks, the night defence response was disappointing, with only 5 aircraft destroyed during the first 5 attacks. The next set of raids were against cities along the east coast, within 12 and 13 group areas, where fighters and controllers had acquired experience of opposing enemy operations, reflected by the 15 aircraft shot down during the next 4 attacks on the east coast. Before 1942, the long detection wavelengths used by AI sets had limited the operating height and detection range of fighters due to ground return. The range of the set was limited to the height of the aircraft above the ground, otherwise the target pulse merged into the ground return Christmas tree. The cavity magnetron enabled the RAF to introduce AI Mark 7 radar capable of operation at the 9 cm wavelength by the end of 1941. This was an interim design, so only a limited number of sets were manufactured to avoid production being delayed while the design was finalised, and lacked homing beacons or IFF, but it eliminated the ground return problem. In July 1942, the operational deployment of AI Mark 7, 37 sets distributed between 4 Beaufighter squadrons began. This used a thimble nose for the radar scanner, and only 150 AI Mark 7 sets were built in total, all by hand. Although the number of sorties flown by the Luftwaffe during the first quarter of 1942 remained high, the lack of casualties reflects the low-risk nature of the operations. Sortie numbers then peaked in April during the Baedeker raids and remained high until August 1942. Increased fighter sorties were flown against these raids, rising progressively throughout the year. Throughout 1941, the use of Cat-Sci fighters had only been effective during highly concentrated raids, and unfavourable conditions in 1942 meant few enemy aircraft were destroyed, described officially as moderate results, with 5 aircraft destroyed during 6 fighter nights. The superiority of AIGCI weapons system was finally proven, and single-engine night fighters were phased out during the first half of the year. As defined squadrons transitioned to twin-engined aircraft, a large number of non-operational squadrons briefly existed, which were not operational until after the Baedeker period ended. During the July attacks on Birmingham, however, these additional squadrons were suitably trained and experienced, and the Luftwaffe suffered unacceptable losses. Fighter Command finally achieved the figure of 20 AI squadrons late in 1942, which Air Marshal Douglas had demanded while the Blitz was still in progress. We will return to the turbine-light squadrons in a moment. The development of the de Havilland Mosquito from a revolutionary concept using wooden construction gave higher speed and a greater payload than comparable aircraft of conventional design. Though originally intended as an unarmed bomber, an AI fighter requirement was added early in the design process. The first operational aircraft was delivered to 157 Squadron in January 1942, and modifications identified by this unit meant 151 Squadron only became the second operator of the new fighter in April 1942. The first operational Mosquito patrol was flown by 157 Squadron on the 27th of April, but there were no successful combats during the Baedeker attacks. The superior performance of the Mosquito as an AI fighter was not significant during 1942 due to the small number of squadrons available, as by October 1942 only 5 fighter squadrons had equipped with Mosquitoes and not all were operational. These aircraft used AI Mark V, which was the metric AI Mark IV equipped with a target indicator for the pilot, reflecting the pilot-centric nature of the service, which has been described by an experienced radar operator as a blunder and retrograde step, since it distracted the pilot during the final stages of the interception. This meant that contacts were lost which could have been held with AI Mark IV. And throughout 1942, there were disquieting rumours of continued trouble with AI Mark V, reports of which reached the Secretary of State for Air by the beginning of 1943. From July 1941, Fighter Command began to receive experimental turbine-light Havocs fitted with Helmore searchlights in place of armament. As with the long aerial mine, the idea for this system originated with Frederick Lindemann, who, although described as brilliant but arrogant, still made a contribution to the Allied victory due to his ability to present data visually to promote a strategy. His flawed judgment about technology discounted the potential of radar before the war began, and had extended the use of the long aerial mine long after the shortcomings of the weapon became obvious. He later argued that Germany were incapable of developing a flying bomb, and after the V-1 was operational, that they could not successfully deploy a ballistic missile that would reach London. Lindemann was convinced it was self-evident that the easiest way to intercept at night is to turn night into day by the use of artificial light, and persuaded Churchill to coerce the RAF into trials with chemical searchlights in September 1940. This was to be achieved by the use of flares, released in pairs from under the wings and towed 3 feet behind the trailing edge, in close proximity to the fuel tanks, a fire hazard that would have impressed the crew almost as much as being illuminated as a perfect target for every Luftwaffe gunner in the vicinity. Documentation on the outcome of this trial have not survived, but must have been sufficiently encouraging, or Lindemann's relentless bullying meant the trial was extended. By the end of October 1940, 4 Fairey battles had been assigned to 29 Squadron, just as they were transitioning from Blenheims to bow fighters, which was a distraction they could have done without as they tried to perfect the process of AI interception. These battles were the TT or target towing version, and there is no record whether they were camouflaged or in standard yellow and black stripes as shown here. A wind-powered winch normally extended a target drogue, essentially a long wind socket a respectable distance behind the aircraft as a gunnery target, so the flares would at least be an acceptable gap from any fuel source. The 29th Squadron Operations Record Book mentions the flare trial for the first time on the 26th of November, when aircrew were instructed in launching flares and using the winch, while mentioning this was not the first time this procedure had been practiced. A towing practice was carried out that night, using towed flares to illuminate a Blenheim, which could not be seen if the flare was more than 100 yards away from the target aircraft. The evaluating aircraft were underwhelmed by the trial, considering that an attacking aircraft would be dazzled by the flare before an attack could be made, and the flare made the towing aircraft an easy target. Their conclusion was the idea of chemical searchlights was open to serious criticism, but Fighter Command, presumably under pressure from Lindemann and ultimately Churchill, were anxious for further tests, which the squadron were to carry out at the first suitable opportunity. Such opportunities appear to have been limited, with only 2 further tests in December and a final trial in February 1941, after which experiments were suspended. By this time, an aerial searchlight powered by lightweight batteries, in 1941 terms, was under development, with the trial installation in an aircraft hailed as having great promise. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, the Chief of the Air Staff, had reservations about atmospheric conditions negating searchlight beams, but Lindemann persevered, suggesting or threatening the revival of flare methods. The usefulness of these aircraft was not demonstrated in 1941, as the turbine light flights, equivalent to 5 squadrons of Havocs, were beset by aircrew shortages over the winter of 1941-42. The urge to validate the aerial searchlight concept was apparent in the orders issued to fighter groups in April 1942 during the Baedeker attacks, with Douglas signalling, "I am particularly anxious to use the turbine lights, and these also should be put into the air early." Moreover, Douglas sent a personal message to operational groups, noting a curious reluctance on the part of all concerned to employ turbine lights operationally. The expectations of turbine light capabilities by RAF commanders and the government, "we should depend on dark nights upon our turbine light flights for our main defence," were clearly not shared by operational units and crews. As an intruder aircraft, the Havoc was faster and more robust than the Blenheim, while as an AI fighter, performance was comparable to early Beaufighters. The only way to accommodate both AI radar and searchlight in a Havoc was for the aircraft to be unarmed, so equipping 10 flights with turbine light aircraft denied Fighter Command additional AI squadrons. Delivery of aircraft to squadrons was initially slow due to long aerial mine conversions being prioritised over those for intruder or AI versions, which did not begin to arrive until March 1941. The number of aircraft available only increased slowly and did not reflect actual availability. The 1 Havoc AI fighter squadron was operational by April 1941, but the priority given to Mutton delayed the AI fighter for 2 months when the Blitz was at its height. Without the distraction of questionable weapons systems, aircraft and crews could have been found to equip 2 squadrons to compensate for low Beaufighter numbers. As the only way to fit both the AI radar and searchlight in Havocs was to remove the guns, it was necessary to use another aircraft to shoot down anything illuminated by the turbine light searchlight. This required the use of Hurricane satellite or parasite fighters, and Lindemann never considered the coordination and tactics required for this. Using GCI and AI, the formation had to close within 1,000 feet, but the Havoc did not then close into visual range. The Hurricanes moved forward to intercept, and after 20 seconds the Havoc illuminated the target. In practice, the German bomber banked as soon as it was illuminated. Then, as one historian has described, the Hurricanes got in each other's way, and the Havoc's way, or they obstructed the beam. This meant that the target got away, while a Havoc and 2 rather hapless Hurricanes floundered about completely lost, with their pilot's night-adapted vision destroyed. In hindsight, it is difficult to argue how taking the guns out of a fighter and replacing them with a searchlight could ever be a good idea, or see why it was ever considered in the first place. Night interception was a complex process consisting of multiple steps. The failure of any would prevent an interception. The turbine light system complicated and extended the process, reducing the opportunity of a successful combat. After finally being cleared for operations during the Baedeker attacks, early results of the tactic were hardly encouraging, with only 2 enemy contacts during the period. In the first contact, the Havoc succeeded in holding the enemy aircraft in its searchlight beam for over 10 seconds, but for various reasons the satellite fighter was unable to get into a position suitable for combat. Although the second contact on the 30th of April 1st of May resulted in a Heinkel 111 being claimed as destroyed, the Hurricane was in visual range before the searchlight was deployed and attacked without the German bomber being illuminated. On the 4th of May, however, one turbine light did achieve a successful combat, but due to its nature the details were heavily suppressed. Near Norwich, a Havoc illuminated a bomber which was shot down by the accompanying hurricane. This success was quickly overshadowed by the realization that the aircraft was an RAF Sterling returning from a bombing operation. The crew were able to parachute to safety, but they were then taken to the same airfields as the errant turbine light unit, where there was nearly a riot. In his memoirs, Douglas conceded turbine light cost a great deal of money and time and effort, and the weight of all its equipment and obstruction in its nose slowed up the Havoc too much when it came to chasing enemy bombers. He complained of technical difficulties that were hard to overcome, but then conceded that in operation the turbine light was surpassed in effectiveness by the straightforward radar-equipped night fighter. It should be noted that armed AI Havocs had no difficulty in chasing enemy bombers. The operational record of turbine light throughout these 6 months was underwhelming. One bomber was damaged, only other results were inconclusive, and since all but 3 satellite Hurricane squadrons had been withdrawn for overseas service, Fighter Command converted the turbine light flight into composite squadrons with 6 each of turbine light and Hurricanes. By the time of the first searchlight installation, the 5 AI fighter squadrons had shot down double figures of German bombers for the 3rd month running, demonstrating that training and experience of night interception was achieving success. The uncompromising support of Lindemann and his hostility towards AI radar meant there was no likelihood of turbine light being abandoned at that stage, so this denied Fighter Command extra AI fighters. Therefore, Douglas's assertion that had the turbine light scheme been fully operational in this early phase, a measure of success might have been achieved is not supported by the available evidence. This table demonstrates the superior performance of the centrometric AI Mark 7 radar, which was introduced around the same time as the aerial searchlight system. The AI Mark 7 results were achieved by 37 aircraft distributed between 4 squadrons, which together claimed 25% of all aircraft destroyed by AI fighters, while forming around 10% of the AI fighter force. If the great deal of money and time and effort spent on the 90 turbine light aircraft had been used to increase the quantity of AI Mark 7 radar sets, the number of aircraft shot down by Fighter Command during 1942 could have been significantly increased. On the 17th of December 1942, the turbine light squadrons were finally abolished due to the stringency of the manpower situation and because the development of more effective means of night defence did not justify the continuing locking up of considerable resources. The question remains why Douglas persisted with long aerial mines and turbine light despite the clear inadequacies of these systems. The historical branch narrative described the system as something of a white elephant, while a former pilot was more scathing, saying it amounted to the flogging of dead horses. One member of the historical branch has noted that Douglas saw his predecessor, Dowding, get sacked for refusing to endanger pilots by using single-engine fighters at night, and because of the aggressive support of Lindemann and his powerful ally in Churchill, decided that he should perhaps go along with such methods in order to keep his job. Once Douglas knew his time at Fighter Command was coming to an end, he could initiate the discontinuation of turbine light without risking his career. The superiority of AI radar over all other forms of night air defence was confirmed when turbine light was discontinued. From a maximum of 20 AI squadrons in October 1942, by the start of 1943, 19 squadrons remained, which fluctuated throughout the year as squadrons were formed and then posted overseas. Although the number of air squadrons decreased over the year, the quality of night defence improved as Mosquitoes replaced bow fighters and metric radar upgraded to centrometric equipment. The first AI Mark 8A radar was introduced in January 1943 to replace the Mark 7. Initially only bow fighter squadrons were equipped, and it was not until later in the year that Mosquito 12s began to reach squadrons. The first Mosquitoes with AI Mark 8 arrived at squadrons in March 1943, but re-equipment was initially slower than with bow fighters. The limited number of hand-built AI Mark 7 radar sets available in 1942 were gradually replaced by AI Mark 8, of which the first 500 intermediate sets were hand-built before mass production began. By September, AI Mark 8 was in use by 6 squadrons, while the other 8 continued to use AI Mark 4 and 5. The standardized centrometric radar clearly demonstrated superior performance. Compared to previous years, the phenomenon of overclaiming was much reduced in 1943. From German losses, the Air Historical Branch estimated that 183 aircraft were lost at night over the UK, with another 32 damaged. Of the 208 aircraft claimed as destroyed or probably destroyed, 88% were actually lost, demonstrating how much the training and experience had increased the efficiency of the defence systems. So, in conclusion, the introduction of the Beaufighter into service was faster than any other contemporary fighter, so its impact on the night battle increased in line with the number of aircraft available. After the original Blenheim squadrons had been re-equipped, further expansion of night air defence stalled. The disappointing initial performance of AI prompted Fighter Command to consider less conventional means of air defence, including Mutton. Although Havoc aircraft were misused, for the majority of 1941, fighter squadrons had more aircraft than operational crews to fly them. The Turbine-Light aerial searchlight was a serious distraction from March 1941, which wasted Havoc aircraft that could have equipped additional AI squadrons. For a short period there were a large number of non-operational squadrons, which unfortunately coincided with the Baedeker raids, when extra AI squadrons might have caused unsustainable losses to the Luftwaffe, much earlier than the attacks on the West Midlands in July 1942. The maturity and reliability of AI GCI was undisputed, with centrometric radar notably superior, although lack of equipment limited impact throughout the year, and it took until the end of the year before Turbine Light was discontinued. With the abolition of non-effective types of air defence, Fighter Command consolidated the AI GCI weapons system, the Mosquito surpassed the Beaufighter as the standard AI fighter, and centrometric radar overtook metric systems for the first time. Thank you.
Okay, so we're back. I think first of all I should really thank all of you for having borne with us as we got through those problems. Fortunately we were able to get onto YouTube, and we're now joined by Stephen, who's going to take some questions. Before then, I should say that we're going to be using the same platform, hopefully with less issues, for both our conference on the 28th and the 29th of September and for the remaining lectures which are on our programme, which should all go ahead as scheduled. With the exception of mine, because I'm likely to give up that spot for somebody else to come in and talk. So the next lecture, which we'll be hosting on Crowdcast, which will be completely live, will be Victoria Taylor's on the 8th of October, which will be run in association with Royal Aeronautical Society as part of their Trenchard lectures. Before then, we do have the conference, and details of that are up on our website. And I'd really encourage you all to register for it if you haven't already, because it's a fascinating look at the period between 1945 and 49 as the RAF adapts to a world which is transformed around it. But Stephen, I really enjoyed your lecture. Thank you so much for joining us. We've pre-recorded that initial period so that if there were technical problems, which we assume wouldn't be at our end, we would be able to get through them. And fortunately, we were just about able to. And hopefully most of our audience is now back with us. I thought I'd like to begin by asking you about aircrew training, because I know that's a topic you're interested in as well.
Yeah.
And to what extent do you think that the RAF's failure, in many ways, to train its crews in night flying in the interwar period, particularly in the run-up to the war, really affected its attempts to then solve the night interception problems from 1940 onwards?
The major problem was that most people didn't fly at night very often prior to the Second World War. As the pilot training progressed during the early war period, pilots were being trained to fly at night. When the Battle of Britain pilot supply crisis happened, all night flying training was abandoned and then didn't actually begin again until December 1940. So you've got this gap from about July to December 1940 where you're not training anyone to fly at night, so you're relying on pre-war pilots who have night fighting experience, plus bomber pilots who are doing a second tour in Fighter Command. Guy Gibson is a good example. He does a tour in Hampdens and then comes to Fighter Command as a Beaufighter pilot in December 1940. So you've got this period where they're really struggling to actually get anyone who can fly successfully at night. There's lots of accidents, lots of aircraft written off, which doesn't do an awful lot for people's confidence as well. So yes, I think the problem really was 1940, when they knew they needed to train pilots at night, but they didn't have the resources or the capability of doing it.
Okay. And I should say to our audience who has joined with us, you can ask questions for Stephen by posting them in Ask a Question at the bottom. And we've already had a few come in, Stephen. And so I thought this is actually a really interesting question from Trent. Can you touch on the development of radar beacons for night fighters, separate from Type 2 and then Type 3 IFFs, or identification friend or foe, and explain why the night fighters in the UK chose to add the extra weight and indeed the electrical drain from those equipments to get those additional beacons?
That's a huge topic. Let's see if I can actually summarize it. IFF was one of these political hot potatoes which people like Lindemann used against Dowding and Fighter Command to try and argue against the use of radar. By the time they came up with the IFF solution, which was the Type 2, I think, which worked, it was only actually triggered by Chain Home, which operated on a 10 to 13 meter wavelength. But unfortunately, it wouldn't work with Chain Home Low, which is 1.5 meter wavelength, or the GCI, which is 1.5 meter wavelength, or the onboard aircraft interception radar, which is also 1.5 meter wavelength. So you have this whole saga of them actually going to a beacon system, which is basically just clagging a system, sorry for the people who aren't from the UK, bolting on an extra system. It was inefficient, but there was a war on and they had to have a solution. But the sort of like the comments and the criticisms about IFF continued to the extent that the RAF spent an enormous amount of money developing infrared telescopes and infrared detectors on aircraft, which are going to be used to actually identify friendly aircraft. Fortunately, just before they were going to introduce it, they managed to get an IFF solution. So that was another huge amount of money, which was wasted, like things like long aerial mines and turbine light as well. That was something else that I could have spoken about, but obviously I had to choose certain things, and those two were even more stupid than the infrared telescope.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I wanted to ask you actually, from when we first talked about this, I thought, I'm going to ask this really mean question of Stephen in the middle of our lecture, because Edward Bowen writes in Radar Days that one of the initial air intercept radars, the work they were doing with it, was set back by the Blenheim Squadron, which had been first equipped with it, having their aircraft removed, so that those aircraft could then be sent to Norway. And he said it completely disrupted all of the training, and that this experience was recreated, not the same thing, but that disruption was recreated several times during the early period. I mean, is that something you found as well?
Yeah, you were talking about the aircraft interception radar being taken, or the aircraft to send to Norway. Well, when the first aircraft interception radar was built, Dowding wanted aircraft to be equipped with it so they could actually develop tactics. So the radar was a really, really crude prototype. One of the major problems with it was you couldn't tell which direction the signal was coming from properly, but he wanted some aircraft equipped. So the team actually hand-built 21 sets to put into Blenheim aircraft. But I think it was Bowen again. He wrote that it just completely disrupted the program. They lost maybe 5 months in development, which is why you get the AI Mark IV only turning up in July, which is probably quite serendipitous because the Beaufighter wasn't available before July and it wouldn't have done much good in Blenheim. But yeah, the early aircraft interception radar program is beset by people making strange decisions and just tending to put the program back for very, very arbitrary reasons.
Yeah, I think for those who haven't read Bowen's book, it's a great read, particularly for this period. He describes the whole establishment being packed off from the south coast, where it's well established, at the outbreak of war to the sort of,
Dundee, wasn't it?
yeah, right up in the north of Scotland.
Yeah.
Dundee's being generous. It's like an hour outside of Dundee, I think.
Well, that's where they got the train to, and then they hung around for hours, and then, oh, who were you? Oh, we weren't expecting you, and there was no equipment, no facilities, so they lost months there as well. And in reality, they probably moved out of the southeast long before they needed to.
Yeah. So we've got a poll at the bottom asking about the best Allied night fighter of the war, and one of the ones we put in is the P-61, which is the Black Widow, which is of course designed around radar equipment. But
the only one, really.
Exactly. That raises a really interesting point, though, isn't it? How many of these difficulties are a case of just at the start finding an aircraft which is available and getting the radar sets into it, and obviously those ones which are chosen are the ones which are available, which are expendable essentially into lower performance. And then as the war goes on, it's using aircraft which aren't designed for the purpose and trying to get them to meet the role. It's about one of the biggest difficulties Fighter Command faces.
I'm not convinced by that, because I think that the Beaufighter was the right aircraft in the right place at the right time. Yes, it wasn't designed as a radar night fighter, it was designed as a heavy fighter, but because of that, it had a very generous sized fuselage, and the early non-centrometric radar fitted into it without too many problems. Yeah, there was early problems with damp, and there was problems with the early cannons as well. But the basis of the aircraft was really, really sound. And by May 1941, it was a really good working weapons system. I think that the superiority of the Mosquitoes being over-exaggerated. I don't really think the Mosquito got into its stride until the middle of 1943, when it was equipped with centrometric radar. I've read several books by radar operators who criticized the early Mosquito with the AI Mark V, which they reckon was a disaster. So the Mosquito really didn't become a factor until the middle of 1943. And your poll says which was the best Allied night fighter of the war. I think a better question would be which was the most useful Allied night fighter of the war, and I think that has to be the Beaufighter. Even the US Army Air Force grudgingly accepted they were going to have to use it as well, long before they actually managed to get hold of the P-61.
Yeah. So we've got ties in quite nicely with a question George has asked, which was what was the radio system being used by the Beaufighter? Questions immediately skipped away. There you go. What was the radio system on the early Beaufighter being used?
Well, the Beaufighter was basically built. Well, it wasn't built to carry it, but the AI Mark IV, which was the first really practical metric radar system, was fitted to the Beaufighter. The first sets were available in about July, which serendipitously coincided with the availability of the first Beaufighter. So the aircraft and radar were basically put together at the same time, and then started going to squadron service at the end of September 1940. People are saying, well, that's really late because the Blitz had started by then. But I think a lot of people don't realize the Beaufighter didn't fly for the first time until September 1939. So it was really a tremendous effort to actually get the aircraft into squadron service within a year, when you compare it to how long it took other aircraft of the same era to get into service.
Yeah, we talked about the radar there, which is coming in, and I think it's quite useful, but it's designed sort of almost at the same time. And does that allow the crews that additional opportunity to get up to speed on the equipment? Because it does seem the RAF has this slight problem with technically skilled personnel. Pilots seem to refuse to acknowledge the existence of the technical equipment in their aircraft, radio, VHF into radar itself. So was it a case of getting enough skilled technical personnel into the RAF, or making sure it was the right people directed to the right roles?
The struggle to get pilots that could actually see in the dark for a start. In December 1940, there was a survey done of all of the pilots in night fighter squadrons, and they found that 20% of them, the night vision was so bad they shouldn't be flying at night. So they hadn't screened the pilots properly from the start. Originally, the radar operators were either civilian personnel who'd been conscripted into the RAF, or ex-air gunners, or just people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time and had been sent on a radar course. And it took an awful lot of time to actually codify that. You're getting well into 1941 before you're actually getting a situation where a radar operator who's flown all night isn't dragged out of bed by the station warrant officer to go and wash floors, because as far as he's concerned, he's just a spare aircraft hand, and he's not clear to actually know anything about the radar systems that are being used. So yeah, and the pilots, you tend to find that the pilots that are flying at night are probably a bit more technically minded than the day fighter pilots, which does help a lot, because they actually start, once they realize that the equipment's going to work, if they follow the directions of the operators, when the equipment works, of course, that they're going to actually get some success. They start to respect the operators and are very big advocates for the operators going forward.
I was going to ask Stephen, are there any accounts of the sort of German reaction to Fighter Command's increasing efforts at night, either from the beginning period where there's no opposition at night, it's a doddle, to the later period when the night defence has really got its act together and there's a much greater risk?
I got hold of some documents which came from the Moscow archives that had been captured at the end of the Second World War. My supervisor managed to get them from Professor Richard Overy, and one was, they were basically a monthly commentary on what was happening within the Luftwaffe, and the one for May and June 1941 is actually talking about just how much more prevalent night fighters are, and it's quite clear that they're operating under ground control and have onboard radar due to the number of aircraft that are reporting being attacked. So the Luftwaffe were very aware, certainly from the mid part of 1941, they were up against radar-equipped night fighters.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a really great question which has come in from Dirk, which is what ground control interception systems were available for deployment in the Mediterranean? So, for instance, Malta. There were both fighters sent out there. How did they deal with interceptions?
They did actually take GCI stations out and deploy them throughout the Middle East. The original GCI stations were known as mobile stations. Basically, it was a caravan with a spinning aerial on the top. But I remember, I think it was Jimmy Rauncey actually talks about going to visit a GCI station, and out the back there was two poor aircraftmen who were actually pedaling bicycles, which was actually turning the radar aerial, and everything else was just intense and literally came off the back of lorries. These stations sat there for 2-3 years before they were upgraded. But the beauty of them was that you could literally just pack them up, put them into the lorries, drive them somewhere else, and then use them in a different location. And that's pretty much what they did when they deployed GCI to the Middle East.
That's fantastic. I didn't know that, Stephen. That's a picture which is going to stay with me for the rest of the evening. As I look out from my balcony and watch many cyclists going through London, I shall picture those poor airmen. Yeah, so we've got another great question, which was the practice of keeping pilots and operators of AI together with aircraft as a long-term team. And it's asking whether or not that's different from the US Army Air Force practice of rotating night fighter pilots and operators. It does seem like there'd be be better to have a fixed team, doesn't it?
I'm not sure what Trent's meaning about the question. I'm not sure if he's meaning that they rotate the teams by the pilot and the operator would be rotated off operations on a regular basis, or whether they split the operators and the pilots from each other, because certainly the RAF experience was that a pilot and operator could almost second guess each other because they'd worked together for so long. But if Trent's talking about them being deployed indefinitely, that didn't happen. They still did a tour just like any other aircrew, and then they would actually go on a rest tour, which is normally going to an operational training unit or to group headquarters or fighter command headquarters, and then come back onto operations after 6 to 9 months. But there was a huge number of those teams that when they came back on operations requested that they went back with the same pilot or the same operator, because they knew they'd be more successful if they actually worked with that person again. So I'm not quite sure where Trent's question was coming from. I hope that answers it. If he wants to clarify that on Twitter later, I'll try and speak to what he wants to know.
Yeah, I do think it was about the operations and pilots, but I mean Trent will be able to let us know. There's a question about Lindemann, who is of course a polarizing character, to say the least. And it's a question of why did he have so much influence? You know, what was his connection to Churchill, which allowed him to have so much say when Churchill was premier over scientific intelligence?
Well, he'd been Churchill's pet scientist during the 1930s. There's a great story that R.V. Jones tells about when the first committees were formed for the use of radar, and he came in, and he was even at that stage he was trying to promote aerial mines, and Tizard and Jones just didn't have any time for this, so they basically quietly dissolved the committee and then set it up again without Lindemann. Every time Lindemann got involved, he would talk about aerial radar not going to work, and they should be dropping mines attached to parachutes, and he managed to carry this all the way forward, well past the end of the Battle of Britain. He's a peculiar character because he was quite an intelligent person. I mean, he did some of the work that actually proved some of Einstein's theories in the 1900s, the 1910s. And then when he developed the theory to actually do it, he was brave enough to actually go to Farnborough and learn to fly, so he could actually, which kind of talks to him having some confidence in his own calculations. But I said in the lecture that after that he had a difficult relationship with technology. I can't remember where I read that now. I wish I could, but it's a direct quotation from someone.
Yeah, I mean his relationship with Tizard is famously fraught, and Tizard's a great character. And R.V. Jones, that you mentioned as well, his Most Secret War is a brilliant read on this as well. And so it's quite interesting because we do have some good autobiographies by people involved in the development of radar. It makes it quite unique in that way. Both Bowen and Jones have put down their thoughts. It's quite well documented. And I mean, it's one of those areas where it's surprising more research hasn't been done. Do you think that's true?
I still think there's things out there to discover. I was looking through the National Archives catalogue, and there's some great stuff in there about early radar. Of course, the likelihood of actually being able to go and look at it in the next year is practically non-existent. That's a bit of a personal bind at the moment, and I don't think I'm the only researcher who's got that, but I definitely think there's more to be discovered in the archives. I mean, when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at some documents that hadn't been looked at since the official histories were written. And there was stuff in there that had been overlooked because it didn't fit in with the narrative that they wanted to actually portray. And it was really, really interesting to look at the stuff that had been left out. And that basically pushed my PhD in a different direction to maybe it would have gone otherwise. I'm sure you were the same with yours with the Dunkirk research.
Yeah, I should say, James, so you mentioned Richard Overy very kindly gave some documents to you. I had the experience with James Coram where he gave me a nice batch of German documents, which added a year to my PhD.
Yeah.
Thanks, James.
Yes, I had a good grilling from Jim when I presented at the Battle of Britain's 75th anniversary conference at Hendon. He asked me a couple of very difficult questions. He bought me a drink afterwards, so that was fine.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, we've got a nice question about whether or not the RAF mounted intruder raids against the Luftwaffe bomber airfields during the Blitz, and if so, how successful they were.
Yeah, I talked about that during the lecture. The original 6 Blenheim squadrons, very early on, one of the squadrons had the radar taken out and they were used for intruder attacks. And when the Douglas Havoc came online, the first aircraft were actually assigned to the intruder squadron even before they were used for long aerial mine or as AI fighters because they were faster and during the Blitz, there was more German aircraft destroyed on German airfields in France and the Low Countries that were being shot down over the UK, and it caused enormous disruption to the German bomber effort.
Yeah, I'm going to link into that question because we've got one which says, is there any information about how much of the Luftwaffe learned and adapted about successful RAF night fighter techniques? And I'm going to sort of flip that round and say, when it came to when Bomber Command was attacking, when the streams were coming back, the Luftwaffe, often came back over with Britain. Is that sort of similar experience you've spotted there? The Luftwaffe was quite keen to target Bomber Command's airfields and returning aircraft.
The German intruder attacks kind of fizzle out at the end of 1941 for a variety of reasons. Politically, it didn't seem to be achieving anything, although Luftwaffe thought they were. Goering, as usual, didn't listen to the people who actually knew what they were talking about. There was enormous redeployment of squadrons, obviously, to support the Barbarossa campaign and in the Mediterranean. And it's not until 1943 when intruder attacks start again, sort of April 1943, you start getting the Luftwaffe using FW-190s to come over, doing intruder raids, which was a complete disaster because they weren't equipped with radar. The pilots weren't trained to fly at night properly. The first time they tried it, 4 of the aircraft got lost and either landed at RAF Manston or crashed very close to the airfield. The RAF were overjoyed because they got their hands on an absolutely mint condition FW-190, which they'd been desperate to have a look at. They start using the Me-410 to do low-level attacks over fighter and bomber airfields along the east coast using the SD-2 cluster bomb. And these attacks were enormously disruptive, and the RAF were quite worried about them. And then suddenly they get abandoned in September 1943 in favour of going back to do quite trivial raids over London, which don't really achieve an awful lot.
And in terms of the German radar, obviously very different. It doesn't use the cavity magnetron, which obviously influences their choice of technology. They never get to the UHF frequencies that the Allies are, but very different tactics which are employed. The question I'd like to ask you to link into that one, though, is if Britain hadn't been able to develop such effective radar sets, would that have been the inevitable course that we've had to have gone down, similar to the German tactics, either the wild boar raids or the controlled streams?
The wild boar had already been tried by the RAF. That's basically your Cat-Sci fighters. Just send them up, try and get them into a bomber stream or put them over a city that's being attacked with a searchlight illuminating aircraft, and let the single engine fighters without radar attack the German bombers. But because of the fighter command being such pioneers in operational research, they realized very quickly they were getting a lot more effective. The twin engine AI fighters were being a lot more effective than the single engine fighters. And once the production got into full swing and there was the availability of the twin engine fighters was enough, they phased the single engine fighters out. And then centimetric radar comes along, which obviously increases the effectiveness even more.
Yeah, and we've got another question here about the Royal Observer Corps and the radar-equipped posts which fitted in from late 1941, how they were adapted into the night fighter setup, so as being distinct from the V1s. You able to talk about that?
I haven't come across any Royal Observer Corps posts equipped with radar in 1941. The first I know about the radar in Royal Observer Corps posts is when you get into Diver. There was a searchlight control radar, but that wasn't part of the Royal Observer Corps. That was part of the Royal Artillery, part of AA Command.
Yeah, it's nice to talk about the Royal Observer Corps around the Battle of Britain Day, of course, because we was talking about Battle of Britain Day, but it was the Observer's Day first. So yeah, it's a nice moment to link into there. We've got a few minutes left, so I think we'll see if we've got any last pressing questions to get in. So here we've got one from Paul, which did later single-seater fighters have AI in a wing pod? Could they have been effective in this earlier time?
No, because when you get to that radar, it's centrometric. So if it had been earlier on, it would have been a metric set, which is too big to put into a single engine fighter. The AI Mark IV would not fit into. There's a lot of misinformation about the Defiant was fitted with the AI Mark IV. It wasn't. They did fit one to a Defiant, but they had to take the turret off to get the radar in, which basically made it useless as a fighter. They had to wait for the AI Mark VI, which was specifically designed for use with a single engine aircraft, but wasn't really particularly successful. Certainly wasn't anywhere near the sets fitted to US Navy aircraft in the Pacific.
Yeah, I think that's what's quite telling about that, though, is the size of the early sets, of the metric sets. And it's often forgotten just how quickly radar is developed. And from the very early period, where the size of the sets is so much larger than later on in the war, where you could do a lot more complicated things, not least because they're smaller and they're less consuming in terms of the power that they want. So I think the nice question to sort of almost end on is, do you really think that in 1940 there was anything that Britain could have done to defeat the night threat from Germany, given the limitations in radar at the time?
The only way would have been if AI Mark IV had been available 6 months earlier, if the Beaufighter had been available 6 months earlier, but the RAF were fumbling around in the sky in the spring of 1940 with Blenheims, and they already realized that they needed ground control interception radar, and it took until January 1941 for that to become operational. So even if you had two parts of the jigsaw, I think the third part of the jigsaw would have taken the amount of time that it did anyway. So I think the effectiveness of the RAF night air defense was only ever going to start in 1941, and within 2 months you've got a viable night air defense system, which you didn't have from the start of the Blitz until that point.
I think this is a great opportunity to say thank you very much for your lecture, for being so generous in your time in taking all of the questions. You're on Twitter, aren't you? Can you remind us of your handle?
Pardon?
Can you remind us of your handle on Twitter?
At Esmoer1940.
Brilliant. Okay. And I've said one of the things I most enjoyed about your lecture was the talk about Douglas and his rather political decisions around using single-seater fighters.
He's not one of my favourite people, it has to be said.
Okay, well, this is brilliant. I've really enjoyed it, as I've said. Thank you, everyone who joined us as well, and for putting up with technical glitches at the beginning. And to Barney, our AV tech, who, despite those glitches, has managed to get us rolling very well. So thank you all very much.